This monitor comes in at quite an interesting time because I'm currently reviewing the Porsche Taycan 4S Cross Turismo for Totally EV. You can check it up on your pop banner in case you're interested of watching the full-length review of that vehicle. Now here we are looking at a monitor that has been inspired by Porsche design, and to be more specific, it's the AOC Agon Pro PD32M. It comes in at a whopping £1,750 in the UK and $1,800 in the US. Now in terms of specs, you're getting a 32-inch mini LED IPS display that runs 4K at up to 144 Hz. It has the fabled HDMI 2.1 ports for console gamers, and also has HDR 1400 certification with adaptive sync. So to kick off this review, I do want to talk about its refresh rate and resolution, and here the monitor will run natively 10-bit 4K at 144 Hz, which is seriously impressive. In my case, I had a display port connected up to my RTX 3080 and had no such problem in terms of outputting the resolution and refresh rate. Now better still, AOC even include a detailed breakdown in a table as to the different resolutions and refresh rates, and also via USB Type-C, because it does have a Type-C input as well in case you're interested. Now as I did mention, I connected it over DisplayPort and I was able to output 4K at 144 Hz, and it allowed me to conduct my tests. First off, in terms of its input lag, it was seriously impressive, at least with the low input lag mode enabled. Here you can see it scored 2.3 milliseconds, which is not only one of the lowest I've tested to date, but also seriously impressive for a 4K 144 Hz panel. This will certainly appeal to console and PC gamers alike. Now oddly, AOC do provide you the option to disable low input lag mode, which is completely baffling to me, and here you can see that it jumps up to a ridiculous 13.5 milliseconds. I've never seen such discrepancy between the modes being enabled or disabled. Now there's no disadvantages of having low input lag mode enabled permanently, so I'm not really sure why you'd ever want to disable it, and given the results that I've just shared, you certainly want to have that mode enabled permanently. So while its input lag is seriously impressive, what about when it comes to its response time? Well, here I was actually left unimpressed, because in comparison to other 4K 144 Hz monitors, be it with or without HDMI 2.1, this monitor just didn't respond to the same level as I would expect it to. The reason here is because when I was playing a game such as CSGO Global Offensive, the transitions just seemed a little bit slow, even on the higher overdrive modes. Speaking of which, over here you've got 4 overdrive modes: off, weak, medium and strong. Now you'll be able to see over here that at 144 Hz it's actually perfectly acceptable to be running on the strongest mode, overdrive, but as we move down the refresh rate to 120 or say 60 Hz, which will definitely be of interest to console gamers out there which not are able to always use 120 Hz in certain games, you'll notice that the overshoot becomes completely unbearable, so much so that you'll definitely want to dial it down to the medium setting and thus get a little bit of a slower response time from the monitor. Ultimately here, the response time on the monitor isn't all that impressive. Now you might be wondering, where's my objective data? For those who are subscribed, and thanks for subscribing by the way, you will note that I do actually objective data for my response times tests. And unfortunately I was not able to pick them out because the OSRTT tool noticed that there was some PWM flicker, and indeed the monitor does suffer from it and is not a flicker-free monitor due to the mini LEDs being constantly adjusted in terms of brightness. As a result, it means that I have no sort of data to extract from it, at least from my own knowledge and my own ability to do so, and as such I can't really comment on the actual raw numbers of the response time of this monitor. Now indeed the monitor does not have flicker-free technology, and to me I was actually left surprised, because it was the first monitor out of over 200 monitors that I've reviewed to date that actually gave me a headache. I couldn't actually wait to put down the monitor because I just couldn't bear to constantly look at it for longer periods of time, even when I was gaming or even just browsing the desktop. The monitor does indeed suffer from it, and even from the UFO test you might be able to notice that there's 2 lines that are appearing, and this is indeed due to the fact that the monitor does have PWM flicker. Now aside from this, the misery continues, because when I was testing the NVIDIA G-Sync compatibility with my RTX 3080 over HDMI or DisplayPort, the monitor was not able to reproduce it. It was producing some flickering, and in the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, well, well, it didn't run altogether. It was just a complete black screen, which would indicate that the G-Sync cannot run. Now, of course, this does have AMD FreeSync technology, and therefore if you have an AMD graphics card, you can benefit from tear-free gaming. And of course, if you're on console as well, this will be the technology that is used. So it might be a little bit redundant for some people out there, but it's surprising, however, to see a monitor in this day and age that doesn't actually support NVIDIA G-Sync, or even the fact that the monitor at this price point doesn't actually have a native G-Sync module built in for the full VRR range. Here you will be going from 48 Hz up to 144 Hz rather than getting the full 1 to 144 Hz VRR range if the monitor had a native G-Sync module. Now next up we get onto HDR, and here you'd expect a monitor with 1152 local dimming zones, a mini LED structure and a display HDR 1400 certification to absolutely blow your socks off. But unfortunately that was not the case. My experience on Destiny 2 was seriously subdued, and in comparison to other monitors that I've tested, be it display HDR 1000 or 600 monitors, I was just felt that the other monitors did a lot better job in giving me that lifelike reproduction. Don't get me wrong, the AOC monitor does get very bright, but that's about it. Furthermore, it was actually pretty disappointing to see that there was quite a lot of haloing and blooming that was occurring. Indeed, this effect was noticeable even in game, whereby I was running my cursor around on the Destiny 2 menu, and worse still, if I was to take it on a pitch black image and move my cursor, the trail was really noticeable. And I've noticed some people online to actually complain about it and even compare it to some of the other 4K 144 Hz monitors with such HDR certification. Suffice to say, over here this is quite noticeable, and even for myself I just found it to be unacceptable. Worse still, the monitor does not have local dimming support in SDR, and this is quite baffling to me. I think AOC should really integrate it, but unfortunately that's not the case, and as a result means that if you do want that better contrast ratio and you want the ability to have those local dimming zones to be activated, then you're going to have to run an HDR signal. Now, to conclude the gaming section, I should have a quick word for console gamers, and indeed the monitor will run 4K at 120Hz or 4K at 60Hz, and of course you can downscale it as well if you so wish. Just bear in mind that not every game will run 4K at 120Hz, and furthermore your console might actually struggle to consistently output 4K at 120Hz, so you might see some dips in terms of frame rate. Nonetheless, over here it's very impressive to see HDMI 2.1 ports on the monitor, and as a result means that console gamers and PC gamers can benefit from that increased bandwidth and thus get 4K at 120Hz, or if you're on PC, 144Hz. So with that out of the way, what about when it comes to image quality? Well, this monitor runs a 32-inch IPS panel with the mini LED structure, and also has a dedicated sRGB emulation mode which you can select through the OSD. In said mode, you can see that it hits 95% in gamut coverage and 95.3% in gamut volume. You can see below here how it compares to the sRGB standard. In terms of the average delta E, it sits at a low 0.74 and a maximum of 1.92, meaning it can actually be used for serious color editing or video grading. The tested contrast ratio is a little bit lower than expected for an IPS panel, but nonetheless expected at 1003:1, and as for the measured white point in comparison to the 6500 target, it hits pretty close at 6286 Kelvin at 100%. As for the gamma curve, it's pretty much on point to the 2.2 standard, which is further impressive. Now, if you're not going to be doing any sort of image or video grading work, you might want to run it on its wider color gamut. In other words, running it, for example, on the warm preset. Here you'll be able to see that the gamut coverage and gamut volume have been affected positively, whereby here it's going more towards the DCI-P3 modes. Although that said, below you can see that the DCI-P3 box hasn't been quite hit perfectly, and as a result means that color accuracy isn't that great. Now, in comparison to the sRGB color accuracy, you can see here that it's undoubtedly dropped to 4.37 and 11.51, whereby higher is worse. As for the measured white point, it's still pretty much on the target at 6716 Kelvin at 100%, and as for its gamma, it is almost as good as the sRGB mode, which is again another impressive trait. Now you might have picked out that there were different brightness levels stated on the screenshots that I just shared, and indeed over here I found it a little bit odd how its HDR brightness was affected by the different window sizes. Normally a smaller window size is actually a little bit better, but this seemed to be somewhat of the opposite case. On a 25 to 49% window I hit 1425 nits, but as I dropped down to 9% or 4%, it dropped down respectively. Now, it should be said that its max SDR brightness was seriously impressive at just shy of 600 nits, and in terms of minimum brightness, it gets down all the way to 58 nits. It should be mindful as well that the monitor has got a locked sRGB brightness and it sits at 238 nits, which is a little bit of shame, but 238 nits should suffice on most users' scenarios. Now this does perfectly lead me onto brightness uniformity, where you'll be able to see on your screen right now that it's actually pretty poor across the board. Of course, it's very much panel lottery as well. Now this could be potentially due to the fact that the monitor does suffer from PWM flicker and therefore it was spewing out different results than it should, but nonetheless I can only share from what I have tested. As for the backlight bleed, it is somewhat acceptable, but again isn't that impressive for a monitor of its price or class. You'd expect pretty much perfection across the board, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. And note, these images were shot in SDR and therefore didn't benefit from local dimming. So moving on to the monitor's OST that can be accessed through a physical joystick button found behind the monitor or via a wireless gaming keypad, as AOC call it. Here the monitor has got a plethora of different options. Now first off, I don't really like this design that AOC or Porsche Design have chosen, because frankly the resolution of the writing over here just seems a little bit off. Specifically if you're running HDR, it might be a little bit hard to see what is actually available. Nonetheless, over here through the OST setup you have got basic options, and over here you might want to select between the different USB options. So for example, USB 3.1 Gen 1. Now via the extra you have got the logo projection. Now the logo projection sits underneath the monitor where the stand is. I don't quite see the point of this. It's very much the same comments I've said previously in other AOC branded monitor reviews, but nonetheless if you do want to have that AOC branding, then you can do at the bottom of the monitor. What's quite useful over here however is the resolution and the refresh rate, which is noticed at the bottom, and to say if it's in SDR or HDR. Now light effects is the LED lights which reside behind the monitor. Now they do look pretty nice, but yet again are somewhat pointless because you're never going to look at the rear of the monitor. Furthermore, I did actually notice that there's a little bit of a buzzing sound coming from it. Here's how it sounds like. Now indeed that small little buzzing sound does go incrementally higher when you go on the stronger levels, but if you were to disable it then that buzzing sound goes all together. Of course via the lighting effects you can also customize the pattern or the different modes if you so wish. Now as for audio, it is actually pretty impressive. It's got two 8-watt speakers with DTS sound, which I'd very much suggest enabling via the game mode EQ. Of course if you don't want that you can disable it and then it'll give you the option of customizing the frequency range. I think this is pretty much done to the nth degree, but I think a lot of people will probably just want to go on the game mode and then leave the boot sound also disabled, because it's a very loud sound that comes up each time you switch on the monitor, which I think is somewhat pointless, something that I've previously said in reviewing other Porsche design monitors. Now from the color setup you have got the different color temperatures. I would probably suggest warm if you're gaming, or go on the sRGB mode, but do bear in mind what I did mention before in terms of the limitations, and of course you have got a user mode as well. Now as for the image setup, here you have got the luminous max, and you'll probably want to run this on high. Gives you the highest brightness level, at least in HDR mode. As for the HDR mode itself, this is fake emulation modes which you will not want to select. However, when you do have an HDR signal running through it, you will see display HDR, which you'll probably want to use. And then you have got PPB mode, which you can enable over here as well. As for luminance, the brightness itself is very much subjective as to what you like. Likewise with the gamma and contrast, but I would pretty much suggest running these settings as default. As for the gaming settings, I did mention this before in terms of adaptive sync. I didn't get it to run on my RTX 30 3080. And as for the overdrive modes, it really depends as to the game you're playing, but I think most people will be gravitating towards the medium setting. As for low input lag mode, you'll always want to leave this enabled, as I did mention before. And finally, in the HDMI section, if you're connecting this up to a console, you'll want to go on 120Hz mode in order to ensure full capability. But of course, if you're running this with a computer, then you can run on 144Hz at 4K over an HDMI connection. So past the OSD, I do have to reiterate that there's that little bit of buzzing sound from the LEDs of the monitor, and elsewhere there's a little bit of rattle that can occur in certain scenarios with the built-in headphone stands which prop out from the left and right hand side of the monitor, be it in their in or out state. But aside from this, the monitor is actually very stylish, and this is in part due to Porsche design. The aluminium frame stand is very stylish and also very sturdy. It provides height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustment, whereby the monitor can be rotated clockwise and anti-clockwise. As for the frontal profile of the monitor, it's got a 3-side borderless design, and as for the bottom bezel, it's pretty sleek and stylish and also has got Porsche design planted at the front of it. Elsewhere, I'd like to point out that this monitor does have a built-in KVM switch, and therefore means that you can plug in your peripherals directly into the USB Type A ports. There's 4 of them to be specific, and this means that you can switch between sources without having to plug in or out your peripherals, and that makes it quite handy for productivity sake. Speaking of which, the monitor has got that USB Type-C port, which also delivers 90 watts of power, which can be quite handy for those people using the monitor with an office laptop and therefore want to simultaneously charge the laptop while using the monitor in order to display as a secondary display. So with all of that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and while I was pretty blown away by the Porsche Taycan 4S Cross Turismo, which I reviewed on Totally EV, the same sort of feelings and sentiments couldn't be said about the Porsche design AOC Agon Pro PD32M, and the reason behind that is because its HDR experience was lackluster. It suffers from haloing and blooming. It also does not have local dimming in SDR. Its response time was a little lackluster in comparison to its competitors. Its sRGB mode has a locked brightness, and elsewhere in terms of build quality, there's a buzzing sound that comes from the LEDs behind the monitor, and there's a bit of rattle that can be heard from the headphone stand. Frankly, there's not really that much going for it in comparison to what else you can find out there in the market, be it if you want or do not want HDMI 2.1. As a result, my suggestions will be down in the description below, including an impressive one that is for PC gamers from AOC themselves. Now, if you've liked this brutally honest review, definitely do let me know in the comment section below, and of course, if you haven't already, drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which are greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering independent reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.